Hey guys, welcome. Glad you guys are joining in for tonight again. This is our episode 3. It's been fun doing these. Lots of stuff to think about. Been getting some good questions. Some of the questions I didn't get to last time, which I'm going to get to tonight. But yeah, I think this is a nice platform for people to ask stuff and just for me to share a little bit. One thing I did on Friday, I was on Rukundo's show and I just told a lot of my story, backstory, all that. I don't often get time to even think about those things. We're so busy. So if you get a chance to watch that one, you get some of that. But some of the things that have been coming through and some of the questions have got a lot to do with planning, preparation. How do you do this? How do you plan? How do you prepare? So what I thought to do is I'm going to look at my workflow. So little title, workflows. I'm getting creative with my OBS here. So talking about workflows, obviously in our industry, there's so much to do with planning, preparation, and depending on what tier you're on. And when I talk about tier, I'm talking about the level of the production. If you're the production manager, if you're the front of a house engineer, if you're monitor engineer, if you're a stage technician, if you're RF tech, broadcast engineer, your sphere of involvement in a production has different levels of engagement when it comes to communication and going through things. So it's very important for someone that walks onto a production. If I take something like broadcast, which we're often involved in, you walk onto a production, and if you can get a single document or something from production that has been there before you, often a couple of days, just to logistics for them to load in and all that, you get the right piece of information from them in terms of planning. You can carry on without having to ask too many questions if it's been planned properly. It's not always the case, depending on who we work with. Sometimes it's amazing. Other times you're like, cool, I've got nothing much to do. I can go, I'm set up quick, got all the information I need, and I carry on. Otherwise, or you get onto somewhere where you walk in and you ask a question and you just get blank faces because they've not gotten to that process yet. And that process is a question as simple as a channel list. When we arrive somewhere to do a broadcast or a live recording, obviously channel count, interfacing with the live production is of paramount. So knowing the channel list, knowing the amount of channels needed beforehand helps us a lot. We often work within a 64, a 128, sometimes 196 platform in terms of channel count, just to prepare ourselves, and we over prepare because things always get added on. Whatever channel list we get presented with, we add 12, 16 lines to that for ambient mics. All the broadcast guys call them effects mics. Tell a live guy you're putting an effects mic up, he thinks you're doing reverb in the room. But yeah, that kind of planning. So from talkgp's perspective and the way that I've trained all my guys is one of the first things we do at the office, whether it is a small gig, a large gig, we start with a channel list. We've got a template. It's such a simple thing that it's often annoying. You want to scribble it down on a piece of paper of a 3-piece band, it's all in your head. That's fine, but write it down, get it down, because you'd be surprised at how informative when you start with a small one and it organically grows, because that's what happens to a patch list. It's organic. It grows. I'm going to share an example here. Might as well tell you guys now. I've spoken to a great friend of mine, Adrian, from Multimedia. Me and him worked well together at The Voice this year or last year. And then we got the opportunity to share at MediaTek on communication structures. We're going to do a show on Wednesday specifically around the planning of that, and we're going to interact with each other just to show the level of communication and planning. I'll talk a little bit about my involvement. He's going to talk a lot about specifically what happened in the room, some of the new technologies and stuff. I'm not going to spoil all his fun for him. But the document I'm going to show you tonight, I thought, let me start with this document because we'll just carry that over to Wednesday. So when we got approached for Voice Season 3, we went into a creative meeting with the creative director, Darren, months before, production went online. And we spoke about, first of all, we listened. What is his vision? How he wants to approach the season creatively from his perspective? What is his storyline in terms of the deliverable to the audience at home? What he wants it to look like? And then based on that information, we spoke through, the different phases that the program goes through. And then we used that, and we sat down. I spoke to the guys and said, can I start with a channel list? We started it on Dropbox, opened it up, shared, connected everybody into the Dropbox that needs to be able to contribute. Started a basic thing. And then before I launched it even, I then spoke to the music director, James, and asked him from his perspective how these 4 phases are going to fit into his plan, because obviously we wanted the program grows organically and creatively from pretty basic, get the job done, blind auditions, all the way to extravaganza in the final. So we took the approach of making a channel list for the worst case scenario. So the worst case scenario is the final episode, which we were literally a year away from. But the communication we had on that was exactly that. We spoke about it. Sorry, I'm looking at my WhatsApps every now and again just to make sure I'm not missing anything. And I planned exactly around that. So we went from, started with a channel list. I started out by just populating it with columns, got the information from James. I'm going to share a screen with you quickly. When I started this patch list, I just put in all the players at the top of the list that's involved in this channel list, stage patch. My note on the stage patch was I leave this blank almost all the time. It's somewhere where your stage techs can make their notes on submult patching, all those kind of things on how they get the signal to the splits. Our reasoning for splits is simply because on this kind of production, we do so many different workflows that it's important to have control in the different areas. So what we do in broadcast and what we do in the live production has got different outcomes. And if I'm completely fixed to what's happening in the room in terms of preamps and doing a MADI link off of them, that means I have to clock to them. That means when I start changing my workflows, when I've got downtime, say for example they're doing rehearsals, which no one else is watching, it's only in the room, I can sit in the OB and we can switch to a virtual sound check and we can carry on. We can do our thing, and when they're ready for us, we switch back, and they never knew we were there or gone. But if I do that if I've got a MADI feed from them and I don't have preamps, if I split away from them and they're doing sound checks and they tweak on a microphone or they do anything and I go back away from my virtual sound check, chances are things are going to be different. Doesn't have to be much, just a little tweak here and there, and I have a challenge on my hands. So we do splits on this for that reason only, to have our separate workflows, and it makes more sense. Not necessarily on this version of the set where we're doing pre-records, where there's stop buttons. We're recording songs that put 15 minutes per song down. You at home see it in a 2-3 minute highlight. Artist walks out, sings a song, chairs turn, bit of interaction, and they walk off. What happens in the real world is very much that, plus then extra, which gives them time to do stuff in post. There's a lot more Q&A involved, talking to the family, and obviously they're making a TV show, so they capture as much as they can. The notes that I've got here in the middle, you'll see that I made notes here. These are specifically notes from James. Blinds, battles, knockout, lives, which is where we're going to see this element. So drum kits everywhere. Percussion was planned for the live rounds. We never actually did it, by the way. Bass guitar was all over the place. Lead guitar, the one was in everything. The second one was only from knockouts and battles. Acoustic guitars and acoustic packs we had everywhere, because these were pretty much, if the coaches decided to sing something, if anything like that happened, we had spare RF going. Keyboards, and you can just see on the side here, it changes the brass section only in the knockouts and lives, and that happened like that. And we carry on. We had more RF obviously planned for in the main blinds and knockouts. We pretty much used 4 handouts because there were 2 duets, So at the most, at one point we had 4 microphones active in the room, and we just stuck to the same mics. They kept being cleaned and they kept being used, and we rotated them just so we had signal flow, because we were also feeding these to ISOs on cameras. So if we use too many mics, it makes it more complicated for the OB guys and for the EVS guys. And then you can see here by the lives, we added a lot more mics, because obviously when we got to the final, we had group songs that we had to think about. We had live backing vocals planned. Then the coaches, we had a main and a backup on every single coach. The presenter had a handheld as well as a lapel. In our context, the reason for the handheld, you can see at this point we've got 2 presenters, both lapels, but we changed that in the blinds and battles. There were lapels. When we got to the live shows, we went to a handheld just so that she can take command of the room, because when the audience is going crazy, you walk out, it's very difficult for Adrian to push that volume to get the audience grabbing her. And then talent lapels, which we rotated, which weren't being used anywhere other than in post during the pre-recorded round. So we put a lapel mic on every artist that went onto stage, so that it was part of the walk-up, looking to the side, waving to family, whispering under their voice, and then they're not on the microphone yet. And then sometimes what happens is they're not performers. So they would sing in a mic, then drop the mic, and they're listening to a coach, and then they answer the coach, but they don't lift the mic. Later in the show, obviously, as they get trained, they do that. But in the beginning, if we didn't have a lapel mic, then the post guy wouldn't have audio. So we put those lapels. So we had 2 runners running microphones. The one was on stage, the one was being taken off someone, the other one was being put on someone, and then we had a spare one. And then we had duets, which made it a bit more complicated. And then some extra mic, Sean Reed, the stage manager, shout mic for Darren. We had a microphone up in the family area, just a rifle mic, watching the people so we can get their reactions. So we planned. So at this point, the channel list is sitting at 92 channels. And then obviously we go down. We've got... what you can see is we don't have Dante in yet, so we start scrolling down. You can start seeing we had a very basic Dante rollout for the blinds and battles. So that went quite well. Simon's making comment about the second drum kit, which we'll show now. So if I go here on this one and I do this, you should be seeing a different version now, which is this one. Yes. So now this is the one that we ended on. So this is a year later from that first original one, which was version A, and this is Lives E. So I think there's all in all about 12 versions that we went through, and this one you can see it has subtabs at the bottom. We were using this Digico rack outputs. We're doing EVS patching, so we were planning what's happening in the OB van, which microphones are going to which EVS machines for ISO, so that we can have an idea of what, there's the EVS ISO list, so that the post guys know what audio they're going to get on which recorded cameras, tie lines, just what was going in which direction. We never got around to populating this page properly. I'm blaming Simon for that. I did ask him to do it. I did my part. I put my name in there. But anyway, but on the main patch, you'll see that our drum kit is there. We added in SPD. Our band's in there. Digital piano, which was carried in and out. Our brass is now in. We had a spare brass. We had a spare channel. Something that happens not often enough is when guys plan their channel list, they don't plan for alterations, and they try and leave spare channels at the end. I normally leave spare channels on an even spot that's in the middle of something. So in here, for example, on that 36 is the even number. If I start the vocal mics on 36, then I'm starting on a even number instead of an odd number. 1 is an odd number. So your patch looms, you go away from working in 2s, 4s, 6s, and 8s. You start working in 3s and then a 5, and then, if you're doing fault finding, if you stick to a structure in terms of how you worry about even your rack patching. And then you can see here's our Ableton now down to 18 tracks. And a note, I was sending 5 stereo stems of 2 monitors on separate outputs, tracks, music, perkbox, ambience far, near and far, which I was sending back to Simon, which he was using in ears. He ended up not using these, he ended up using the ones from FOH, which is from Adrian, because obviously when they switched to virtual sound check, his optical would switch, and then he would get Dante from front of house. But these were always there as a backup. And then we had obviously the Dante lines, and you can see there's double numbers on here, 119, 220, because what we had is we had two Dante machines, two Ableton machines running. I was getting both on my SXL on different sets of channels, and we could switch between the two seamlessly. I had a hot switch, a function switch, which if I pressed the function switch, it would switch between the input sources. The room wouldn't know the difference because the way I was sending it out to the room didn't change. So I would get both machines, and we would test both machines, and I could seamlessly switch. They would both be running, and we often, me and James, would say, let's test it. And he would, in rehearsals, play off the main machine, then play off the backup machine, just to make sure that the levels are there and the sessions are working and all that kind of stuff. Then again, you see a couple of spare channels there, and then we start with lead vox. And you'll notice on the left that we're switching, if you look at our racks, we're switching where we're patching in. So those two spare channels, if they weren't there, then we'd have an odd patching scenario with vocal mics. We had dedicated mics for the coaches for singing, for when they sang. These mics were used for talent at some points, but when the coaches sang, it was normally in a duet scenario, they would be on one of those mics. Again, just pre-planning. And then coaches, same thing, main and backup, presenter, microphone, backup, talent mics. We put them in there, and then what we did is, the first episode of the lives, there was still an elimination, and there was a vote from the public for wild cards and all that. So we had a couple of scenarios within the script where we mic'd them up, because we didn't know how it was going to play out. I told the director what we were doing. It was there. It was ready. We ended up not using it. We had a discussion then after that episode that from now on there isn't need for this anymore, because we're in a completely live scenario. Your MC's on stage managing the situation. If someone was singing with a mic stand, we had enough rehearsals that were coached to take their microphone, talk on their microphone properly and all that. So we did away with this just from a technical perspective, made it a lot simpler for your backstage crew as well. There's our second drum kit that Simon was talking about that we had patched for downstage, because for guest artists that came in, we had extra lines, and we had a 16-way loom, which was, we sort of did that generic list, but it wasn't always the same, depending on who the guest artist was. I think it was Good Luck the one time. They don't have this set up, they're a bunch of keyboard lines and other stuff, so we changed that. EVS feeds back into the room. Obviously, all the underscore music, the experience in the room, the brief from the producers was they want the people watching at home and the people watching in the audience to have experience a similar product. Obviously, if you're in the room, it's never the same as what you're at home, but you don't want to go home and watch the episode on playback and then go, oh, I didn't hear that in the room, or why I didn't remember that happening. So we made sure that we had everything. So we had a post-fade feed going back to Adrian, which he could leave open, and then whatever Ari was playing, from the playback system would spill into the room. We'd preset those levels, we tested them, so when Ari went to his underscore level, it would match the preset level that Adrian had and all that kind of stuff. And there's our effects microphones for the crowd. We played quite a bit with the positioning of these. Obviously, we want to bring the crowd into the production as much as possible. But the one thing that you can't do in a live environment, which you can do in post, is grab your crowd mics, grab a snare somewhere, line them all up so that you don't have phasing and it pulling your mix dead. Because if you open your crowd mics and you've got any kind of delay between your PA and your source, your depth of field, your band just gets pushed back completely. So placement of mics for crowd, for us to use, we had more mics in the room that were going straight to Supersport, which were only used for MC moments, which made the room nice and big. But during the music, I wanted the crowd screaming, the crowd applause and all that kind of stuff. So we planned our positioning of those to be as much in line with the PA as possible. We talk a bit more about that on Wednesday, when Adrian speaks about his Alisa that he ran, because that obviously changes the whole scenario as well. But we did that pretty successfully, and you can see we're sitting on 127 channels, roughly. and that's our live source. And then still this document, if I scroll to the right, you can see our sources, microphone choices, special comments about them, supplier. Obviously, I'm working on it. Multimedia is working on it. What mics are, because the mic choices are a fair, I wouldn't say compromise, but discussion. For live, you can do a lot. For broadcast, you can do a lot. I can choose some mics that'll work really nice for me, but it doesn't work for Adrian, and vice versa. So we spoke about mic choices, and then if I said I want to use this one, he doesn't have one, I've got it, and vice versa. And then we have the supplying of the mic, and we can plan the stand that goes along with that mic. You'll see lower down, you'll see we even have supply from Supersport, because we use their Sennheiser systems as the backup. So we had our Shure systems for all the main mics, and then the Sennheiser systems for the backup. So if something happened in the Shure band, the Sennheisers would take over, and that worked quite well. RF Junkie, MJ was running that for us. We scroll even further to right, you can see here that the track IO, the track live IO that Simon ran off of his SoundGrid patching, he had it in here, what was going to what line. And then we had our Lisa patching, which Adrian did from front of house, so just so you could keep track of what's going on there. So this document grew all the time, and we just keep saving it as version numbers. So we always just follow the latest alphabet one to see what's live. So go back to this picture here for now. So there you guys can see just a channel list. And when I lecture my third years as well, and we talk about channel list planning, the document there's no set plan, there's no set approach to this. You can have a column in there that talks about who wants water on stage and who doesn't. It's really up to you. But the more prepared you are, and you can take this document and you can go, your guys can plan allocations for microphones, all that kind of stuff, and you can really get stuck into the detail of what are your outcomes going to be. Obviously, talking about workflows, how this then relates back to a technical workflow. You saw I spoke about working in even numbers. 8 is a good even number. Most submults are 8 channels or 16 channels. And a rack is 64 or 56. So I was working with the Digigo guys, so their racks are 56 channels. So at 56, and if I scroll down on the left there, you'll notice that at 56, we stopped with the band, and we started at 57 with lead vox, which is then the second rack. So the second rack is where our lead vocals start. But if you look at mine, I've got 64 on my rack. So I stopped at G and we went to A. In terms of my cards on rack 1. If I scroll all the way down here and I go to my effects mics, which I ran, they're on H, stage rack 1 and stage rack 2. So the last card, which is something that's not in the equation for the Digico guys, I was using for something which only affected me. But that means we could talk one-to-one when it came to channel count. If whatever channel or anything was coming off stage, if they were doing something in the room, it would affect me exactly the same way in terms of just fault finding. And then, like I said, simple things like if you get to a spot where there's an odd spot, leave it odd, leave it open, because you never know when you might need that line. You might need that split line, you might need a patch mult line, anything like that. So more spares there. So it works well just to think ahead like that. From a workflow perspective, Simon can come in here as well. I've done monitors for years and years and years. The first thing we do, and even now when I get to an event, front of house is an easy prediction in terms of where it's going to be, out front. But on stage, the thing that I've noticed that catches guys the most that they don't think of at the moment is what's the word? Feng shui. The layout of your tech land and of your monitor land. As a monitor engineer, you need X amount of space around you with your gear and stuff that you have to access. And if your overall space is limited, the rotation of the racks, which way they're facing, where you place different techs, I've seen guys arrive and they've got stage rack splits, RF racks, all that, and they stack it out, they lids off, everything up, and they stage, and that everything looks amazing. But they've got them half meter off the back of the wall because they think it's enough space. Once everything's wired up, that space is gone. Can't get a second person in there. It's not lit once it's dark. You're stepping on cables. You can't walk properly. So the layout of your gear backstage, you need to allow for proper human traffic around them. The right human traffic you've got to think about, because obviously you're setting up and you think you've got it all in control, and then the artist arrives because there's a door over there that everybody has to get onto stage with, or a passage. So you've got to think about that kind of stuff. So as you get in this industry and you've been around for a while, you start picking up on these kind of things, and you start picking up on these layouts. There's nothing worse than trying to fault find in an area that wasn't thought about, because you're literally on top of everything. You've got to pull cables. And it gets very confusing. So think about your layout of your gear. Think about what you need to get to, who needs to work areas. If you speak to any one of the guys that I've worked with on monitor lands and stuff like that, you'll notice that I get quite finicky in the layout, and you plan stuff and it looks like I'm wasting space. But once everything's up and you put people in and all the gears in, it's actually just right. And that comes from experience, obviously, and having done it wrong a lot of times. Having seen it done wrong, having been in the situation where someone else has done it and is now, not in that situation. Having said that, make sure that when you make these decisions of space on a stage is obviously a very expensive commodity backstage, because props are there, sets are there, makeup is there, E&G on these kind of shoots are there, so they're running around with cameras and stuff. So you got to make sure that the space you have is your space to use. And make sure that you communicate with the right people. And then if someone says, listen, you need to move this rack, if that rack can make or break your production, so if they say you need to move this rack now, if that's a very key component, you can't just move it, because there's, it's 64 channels coming to it. If it's a split rack or something, all your cable runs and everything. So make sure that when you put them down before you start running cables, everything's in the right place. And then from there on, talk about cables, is your cable runs onto stage. How do I access the stage? Where do I access the stage? At what point do I turn left into a stage? You don't want to cross anywhere where people are going to have to be walking. In other words, access point for the band, access point for public, when I say public, artists, because they are public, they're not technical. So we don't do floor crossing. Keep it neat. You've got to think of movement. You've got to think of potential movement. You got to think of just all the different things that might happen on a stage. And then just from a camera's perspective, there's nothing worse than people planning everything and then they don't think about, the simple things like making sure your two overhead mic stands are the same brand, and unscratched and set up nicely. Making sure that you don't run a neon green cable as the left and a black one as the right for a keyboard, because you want to ID them down on the bottom, but off camera it looks horrible. So, and taping microphones and marking them. I bought Eddie Sitole and I go way back, and I gave him one of my labeling machines, I think in 2008 or 9, because he was always the RF tech on those Coachbell gigs and some of the gigs we did. He still uses it today. I saw him on Starlight the other day. He still has that little box. I gave it to him. And it's just, you buy the brother tape, it's black tape with white writing, you make a nice number, you stick it on there, on camera. It makes perfect sense if it is seen, because it's neat. If it's not seen, even better. But, white and masking tape around the thing with a number on, if you're a festival, no one's going to see it except the artist, because it's dark and they want to see what mic they've got. But when there's a camera going to be on you, it's the last thing you do. So I see there's some questions. LTC clock. I think what we'll do is on Wednesday, because it's such a big component of this production, I was thinking about it earlier today. I want to do a session on sync in general. If you guys think that's a good idea, please tell me. Simon made some comments about the layout and the church and the planning and stuff, and I think we'll go into that. Simon, if you want to join us on Wednesday, that'll be great. I'll talk to you later. But we're doing it in Afrikaans. I'm kidding. But clocking is a massive thing today, and I often get someone that says a comment, and I saw a comment on a with all the streaming stuff going on in the States and churches and everybody going, and a guy was asking a question about some static noise on his system. And I started reading the comments underneath there, and about 15, 16, 17 comments, and guys talking about earth loops and cable and and one-legged. And I just looked at his thing, and I made a comment. I said, "You're doing X, Y, Z with Dante." He goes, and then he immediately responded. He didn't respond to anybody else because I made sense. And I told him to try two things, and he messaged me back probably about a day later, and he says, "Yes, the problem solved." Now he's got another problem. Then he asked me another question, and it's just about knowing how clock works, know what the role plays, knowing between different platforms. This is why that communication chat me and Adrian did was so vital, because you're running different platforms, consoles, clock rates, all these different things. So everything has to clock in a digital world. So we'll do a session on that if you guys want to. Train of thought, I was reading that. There was a question about that, so I think I answered that. So planning. And then it comes down to, I made a comment the other day where, in my mind, I'll put my drum kit backwards. In other words, I'll start with my overheads on the far left, work it backwards, so I end my drum kit on channel 15, 16, or 12, or whatever with kick drum, because the next thing in line is bass. And working with different genres and different music productions, especially in different genres, when you go from one song to the next, your relationship between your kick and bass, when it comes to the filters, when it comes to the EQ, when it comes to their dynamic ratios, all that is a key aspect to get access to. And if they're next to each other, for me, I work quicker. So for a couple of years, go back 10 years, I think I stopped that. I actually drew up my channel list like that, but I realized that it was just confusing people because it's such an out-of-the-box thing. So I just stuck to doing my patch list as normal. But what I would do at my side on my channel, because I can do layouts and use the layouts, I would often still swap it around just on the layout, just so that for me in my workflow on the console it works well. Console layouts. I made a couple of notes here. Console workflows. The one thing that I said, most of us when we operate, we work with multiple consoles quite regularly, especially when you go to festivals, when you're traveling with a band through corporates or whatever like that. You don't have the luxury of working on your console all the time, or a specific console, even if it's on your rider. I know it's on your rider. Unfortunately, South African productions do not respect riders because there's no consequence. Most of us, when we get an international rider, we try and stick to it, and if you can't do one thing, you'll phone and you'll make a plan, because in their contract it states or else, and there's consequences. South African bands are like, come on guys, there's no budget, just there's X console there and you just got to be happy, and then they do it. But that's another story. But having said that, whether you walk up to a festival and there's a MI market console there, which is music industry, so it's everything below sort of 100,000 Rand. There's a lot of them out there. So in other words, off-the-shelf buys from music shops and stuff like that. Or you'll get the same festival next year. Someone else got the gig, and now there's a 2 million Rand console there. But you're still working with the same band, so you've got to think about your layout. So when it comes to workflows on consoles, I think the most important thing is not necessarily a show file on a stick. It is helpful if you have it. At a festival, it's not helpful. If you're on a Yamaha or anything like that, you know how the systems work. Very few people are prepared with laptops to try and isolate your shows and fix it, because if you load it up, the whole PA goes, the matrix system's gone, and it's a mess. So you can't load your show file unless the desk was purposely set up for you at a event. So your biggest workflow tool in your tool bag is you. You need to have an attack plan of how you want to work. What's the most important thing about the band that you're traveling with? Understanding the technology. In other words, when you walk up and you see the console, in your head, your approach to the console needs to fit your workflow. Because if I walk up to a console which I have no clue about, and there's a techie there, I'll ask him, can I do X, Y, Z? He goes, yes. He goes, show me how. Shows me, and cool, and then I can do my workflow. If I walk up to it and I know the console, I know it can't do this, this, and this, but it can do that, that, and that, I'll adapt my workflow. And my workflow is just, how do I get ergonomically my fingers on the right place without having to press too much buttons? Once the show's running, the last thing I want to do is flip layers, access menu tabs, and all that kind of stuff. I just want to be able to have my fingers on faders and mix the show, be creative. And if you're working on a console where you can't move faders, so there's a stereo channel where they've got their playback running, but it's on the next layer and you can't move it, I would have my own cable in my bag and I would patch into 2 mono channels next to where I want to be. So I might not be able to link the channels, but I've got my faders in the right position. So you just got to think ahead, think about those kind of things. My approach, if I work on a console that gives me all the toys, like the S6L, I can really go overboard, but you can make it too complicated. But if you stick to your basics, you don't have to use 40 VCAs. Just use the structure that you have. Have an idea of, if I have VCAs, how would I utilize them? Why would I utilize them? I run a lot of small shows without VCAs. I've got 10 fingers in my hands. There's 3 pieces on stage. Off I go. I might have the effects on a VCA just so when the talking moments I can pull it down and have my echo return on a VCA maybe, or on a channel if I can have the channel next to me. But it's all about outcome. What is it you want to try and achieve? But because at the end of the day, I made this comment, people, you show people what you do on your fancy consoles and they go, oh, cool, so you don't have to mix anymore. Like, no, I'd spend time preparing scenes and modules and snapshots and things like that so that it frees me up to be more creative. There's nothing more relaxing than knowing that everything's in control. I made the comment the other day in another section, what we want to do is not be reactive. We want to be responsive. Reactive means you didn't plan. You're not ready for it. So when something happens, you grab. You're reacting. If you're responsive and you're in control, which means you understand the technology, you understand the layout, you understand your workflow, the way you've laid it out, and something happens on stage, whether it's someone dropping a mic or grabbing the wrong mic or anything like that, you can respond to that in front of you. I did a thing on the S6L where with the controls now you can set up so many different action-reaction scenarios. So we ran with something at Starlight Classic for Marius. He was running the S6Ls. And I set up a control section that detects any channel above a certain dB reading on the channel, focuses it onto the screen, attentions it, and mutes it. Now, on that stage, you've got 60 odd RF strings mics. And if someone moves their chair and sits on a cable or fiddles with a microphone, those condensers are quite sensitive. It goes loud and he runs his gain structure very, very healthy, which means no channel should go near plus 15, plus 16 in a normal scenario. But one of the things, if you've got a limited fader bank, is when violin 7 starts crackling and popping, you have to find violin 7 because someone sat on the cable or something's gone wrong. If you set up a control group that you hear one click and you look at your screen and you can see violin 7 is muted, which means the system has alerted you to the right channel and taken care of the problem. You can get on your talkback, you can tell the guys on stage, someone check violin 7 for us, please. Have a look at it, you're unmuted. You don't have to have it muted. You can just have it attention. So you can decide for yourself if it's something you want to mute or not. But it's all about just using the technology so that you can not stress about those things so that you can stay creative. Because if you're in the middle of a key point in a song where there's a guitar solo coming out of a vocal point and you're like coming out of the last phrase of the vocal and you hear this on your strings, on most digital consoles on a large channel count, you don't have that fade, those fades. You might have a VCA for strings, but you can't pull the strings down. So what do? You change layers, you go find that one, or you have someone sitting, watching, and trying to ID it for you. But over the years, in the old days, that would be a process, and then you'd panic a little bit maybe, but you manage it. Now with the new toys, you can do it in such a way where the technology helps you and helps you respond to those scenarios. So that's enough about that. What's the time? It's 7:45. I'm going to do some of the questions I had some questions last time from some guys. I've put them here. There we go. It's a question from Michael Isaacs. When dealing with bands, with new bands that you don't know on a festival stage, you're technically ready, the gear is ready, you've line checked your source carefully, placement of mics. How do you deal with musicians then moving things around if you've gotten the source right? Well, there's another question. I'll go back to that one. So that is a good question. I think your most important thing to distinguish there is you've got a line check and you've got a sound check. Your line check you can very easily do without the correct source on stage. In other words, check all your lines, check all your mics, be prepared. On a drum, let's use a drum kit as an example. If you cannot prep the source without the drummer, no matter how much you want. There might have been a drummer on there. It sounded amazing. The new guy's going to come in. He's going to pull the snare closer. He's going to drop a cymbal. He's going to take out a tom. He's going to do X, Y, Z. You have to wait for him to do that. So what we do on festival stages or on a stage where that kind of thing is going to happen, we'll have a tech that's dedicated to drums, a tech that's dedicated to keyboards, ones on the guitars, ones with PVs or whatever, so that when that band change happens, that tech needs to be briefed by front of house or the monitor guy on what to look out for mic. What do we want the snare position to be like? Once the guy sits down, let him sit down, let him settle in, move his snare, move his stuff. And then it's a tech's job to fix the mic into a similar position. Obviously, if he swaps out snares or things like that. If it's the same snare, having the mic in the same position is also not a guarantee because the dynamic of the player changes. But at least if you know the mic is in the right place or someone has made sure the mic is in the right place, you as the engineer at the console can feel good about maybe a gain change or an EQ because you know your mic is right. It's nothing worse than a guy sitting in front of us and new drummers on stage and you start gaining it up, but the guy's pulled his snare 3 inches closer to him, which means the mic has actually gone off the snare and now you're gaining it up. And then in the second song, he's struggling to hear his snare. And he goes like this, ooh, and he grabs the mic and pulls it in while he's playing. I've seen it happen. So make sure your techs are there and your techs are ready. So it's not a matter of you can't get upset with band members. I've had drummers, I put 2 450s, and it was a well-known drummer, does very well, good stuff, got a studio running, everything. I'd put 450s on overheads from Audio Technica. It's a side angle, side address microphone. So he sat down, he looked up, he goes, huh? He thought someone had pulled the cable, so he took the 2 mics and he pointed them down at the kit because they're overheads. And I couldn't but laugh at him, Fortunately, just doing a sound check, so I walked up to him, I explained to him, I said, look at the picture, side angle. He goes, oh, okay, sorry, I didn't know. But now you should have asked as well, but it happens. The other part of your question was, how do you select whom to focus on if the MD hasn't taken charge of the band? I think that's in line with what we were saying the other day. When you do sound checks, we talked about communication. Find out who's the band leader, who's the MD, how do they want to run sound checks. If they haven't taken charge, not everybody has, if it's the lead guitarist, but the guy's struggling with his amp or his pedals are not working, the last thing on his mind is making sure the sound check's running smoothly. So even if you've had that dynamic going, I think it's still up to you to make sure that you keep in control. Your monitor guy, at the end of the day, when it comes to sound check, you run the stage and we follow your lead. If the technical checks are done and now it's time for front of house, patch his talkback through and you take the lead. Don't be disrespectful to the guys, obviously, but if no one's in charge, it's going to be chaos. So from a technical perspective, if when we had the guest artist at The Voice, staying in this context, Simon would be the guy that we waited on him. He was on stage. I'm not on stage. Adrian's not on stage. Wait for the guys already. You make sure his tech's working because no use in me trying to work with the drummer on a sound if he's not settled. So his ears have got to be working. His session placement's got to be working. All of that. So we take our feed off Simon, and once Simon's ready, sort of hands it over. And by that time, we've been following it back quietly. And by the time he's done, we're done. You pay attention, you stay in context. Next question, Katlego. How do you choose mics and consoles for gigs? Well, choosing mics, there's 2 points here. We don't have an open warehouse with just every mic you can choose. We have limited stock that's been bought. If you're working for a company, they've got X microphones that's been allocated to a gig. If you get there, if you know the gear well, you can use the mics that you've got there. If you've got the option and the opportunity to be involved in that choice, all the merrier. I remember a story, Aki, me and Keith Davies were doing something with Cape Town Philharmonic in Cape Town City Hall, and we had a rhythm section in the corner, put the drummer in a fish tank. I had a full orchestra, all that, and Aki came to the gig while we were busy just setting up, and they had allocated mics there according to what we asked for. We had a pretty decent set of mics that we were going to do on the strings and the orchestra and stuff, and then I know Aki's got an amazing microphone collection, like phenomenal. Just 2 of everything you can think of. So I made it like the off-the-fly comment, like, it'd be nice to have that selection. We could just put any mic in the best mic in the right place. And about a half an hour later, this big tog bag arrived with all of his mics, and it was like, I couldn't believe it. And you spent a half an hour going through, like, where do we put these? Where do we put these? And it was fun. We had the opportunity to play. It wasn't a time crush. We had Neumann's overheads over there. We had blue ribbons over there, and we had this over. It was just all over the place, but it was amazing. But having said that, myself, like I said the other day, I've got gear acquisition syndrome. The medication still undeveloped, pretty much like the COVID-19 virus. So over the years, I've built up a nice microphone collection. I buy mics with the eye on what is it that we do. So because we do a lot of recordings, what looks like an overkill sometimes in terms of what we put on the drum kit or even on the guitar amps, which has a phenomenal outcome for the post-production guys and for the studio guys for mixing. For live, it works like a bomb, but the guy could have gotten a live sound, or if it's me, if I've got a 57 top and bottom on the snare, off I go, done, works, I can get it working. But if I had an i5 and a SM81 and which I can put on the snare, and I've got the channels and the opportunities there, we put them on. Can't use them all at the same time. I'll often just pick one at one front of the house that works, but the rest are being recorded. You go to post, your post guy's got the option of which mic works best in the studio environment. So drum kit is an easy one to explain. Your overhead mics, what do you want out of your overheads? The genre plays a little bit of role. You don't want your overhead mics to be, the best mics on the planet if you're on a stage which sounds like a bathroom. If you're in Catsies, the better your overhead mics, the less you can use them because it's so much noise there. So you want your mics to be as close as possible, as defined as possible. You want your hi-hat mic to be a nice narrow pattern cardioid. All these kind of things. You've got to think about the context that you're in. So and also then, right mic in the right scenario in terms of the SPL that it can handle. And then going on with vocals, same thing. I've seen some vocalists that they buy the most expensive microphone because it's recommended and it sounds great on their vocal. It does, really does. But then that microphone is not going to work everywhere. If you're outdoor on an open green field at a high-class wedding, it's going to sound amazing. But then you go next week and you go into a fully tiled room with no carpet, with 2 eons in the 2 corners, and then you wonder why your microphone doesn't sound great and your ears don't work and it's too ambient. And you got to understand the context on what the microphone can actually bring into the scenario when it's too good. There's nothing better than control when it comes to microphone. So if a microphone can control or be controlled onto the source that you need it with, you've got a good outcome. If you've got a microphone that, if I take a KSM8, for example, sure, and I give it to just every vocal because it's a good mic, it's not going to work for anybody that's even remotely inclined to start cupping or holding the mic too high. because of the second capsule at the back. You bring it up, you start getting some weird comb filtering, and eventually it just, 1K boost and off you go, and it sounds horrible. So you got to think, you got to train people from that perspective. Consoles, I think I answered that in workflow. That was the second part of his question. How do you choose a console for a gig? How much money you got? Next question is from Masters. He wants us to talk about peer design and also networking. I think we're going to do that on Wednesday. The peer design, I think you need to have a listen to Adrian on Wednesday. That's going to be quite cool. He's going to give us a nice insights into what went into the mindset around the Alisa and how it's different from everything else. Peer design, in a broader sense of the scenario, where if you're running a small rental company, which a lot of guys do, peer design is something which is a luxury when you get an opportunity. Because if you've spent X amount of money on 8 boxes, which means you've got 4 aside, 4 subs, and that's what you've bought, you have to make that work in as many situations as you can. So your knowledge of that system needs to be extremely deep. You need to know how to get the best of those boxes in any scenario, because that's all you have. If you're a project manager and you're planning a gig, which means you've got no gear, you're now you're planning for a gig in a stadium or in the Dome or somewhere like that, then you start thinking, what kind of gig is it? Is it a classical gig, jazz gig, R&B, hip-hop, pop? What is this? We're doing Kwaito, what are we doing? Because all of those will give an indication as to what the PA needs to be capable of doing, as well as what the audience expectation is. If it's a gospel gig, for example, I made this comment the other day, you need about 30% more PA than what you would need at a rock show in South Africa, because at a rock show, your audience might be screaming, but it's like a white noise under your PA, which means you've got definition. Whereas with a gospel gig, they're singing in unison, word for word, what your main artist is singing and your choir is singing, your backup vocals are singing, which means it's like a purposefully trying to mask it, which means you need to try and get 3-4 dBs above that to get any kind of audible variance in what the crowd's doing to what your audience is doing. So it's power. So it is an interesting conversation, that one, on PA design. Obviously, having decided which PA to use, then looking at coverage, and then understanding, having some basic acoustic knowledge using the software that's available to you, and then taking it from there. There's a lot of do's and don'ts depending on the PAs that you've got. End of the day, coverage is probably your most important. Try and avoid throwing sound where there's no people, which means it can't hit stuff and come back at you. And that also implies you have a PA that's adjustable in that format. You have a PA that can be aligned and controlled to give you sound in the right directions. And then with a system engineer that understands that requirement as well. I think I've answered that one enough for now. What other questions did we have? Johan, any questions? Here's a question. Let me just try and get this. Can't read what it says. How do you adapt to a console you don't know and as you become a last-minute addition, and then the team an hour or two before the show? Well, I think adapting to the console, I would, if I read that question correctly, it's from A. Skulls. It's not about adapting to the console. It's what I said earlier with workflows. If you know what you want to achieve, and you've got like a bucket list of things that you want to be able to do, I'm assuming you know the artist, you know what you need to achieve in terms of whether it be amount of monitor mixes or front of house mixes or anything like that. If you've got limited time on the console, there has to be a priority list as well in terms of your workflow, what you need to get going ASAP, the kind of control you need to going, effects, if any, that you need to get going, all that kind of stuff. And then rather adapt your workflow to the console, not, like he says, adapt to the console, but it's a twofold thing, because you also can't adapt to the console if you don't know the console. And don't be scared to ask. I think I said this the other day, is that one of the mistakes a lot of guys make is thinking they have to know everything. If you're standing behind a console you don't know, there's nothing wrong with asking for help. Nothing. If I've done this many times with youngsters, with old guys like Marius, where you're like, I need to do X, Y, Z. Can this console do it? Yes. No. Okay, how do I do it? Show me how to do it, or do it for me. If it's a festival thing and you've only got 15 minutes turnaround, you can get much more done by standing on the side, step away from the console, let the tech who knows the console step in and say, listen, I need these VCAs, these channels, this bus effect setup, this, and do the layout like this. Then you'll watch him do it. You're learning. And when he's done, you can ask him one or two things, but you can work. It's still your IP, it's still your knowledge, it's still your workflow. You don't have to do everything yourself. So don't be scared to ask questions. Ponzo's asking us to include RF junkies in a session as well. We'll do that. There's another question, will it do RF thing? I think I'll definitely do one with RJ. Me and MJ spoke about that the other day as well. I think I've answered all the questions that I can see. Yes, Yara, I'll have a session on, I just said that. Well, we've reached our hour. Completely on purpose planned that ideally. Sorry about that technical glitch in the middle there. I was just getting happy with my OBS and I realized I missed something in creating all my screen shares. But I think I've given quite a bit of information tonight. Please look out for us. We're going to advertise the session on tomorrow for Wednesday with me and Adrian. We're going to speak to Simon. We might have to do 2 sessions because obviously, when these sessions get too long, we can't have that. Not everybody can stay tuned, so we'll try and break it up. But we'll definitely do that. And then look out for our next one that we're gonna do on the next subject. Like I said in my opening screen, if there's any suggestions on topics we need to cover or questions you want to ask, please like our page. You can mail it to talkgp@soundgp. Excuse the pun, but it works. And then we'll take it from there. And thank you guys for joining. Appreciate it, and we'll see you at the next one.